Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is John Sadowski and I am the High-Tech Crime Liaison with NW3C. We are excited about this event and to be partnering with Magnet Forensics. Magnet has been a strong supporter of the law enforcement community and aligns with NW3C's mission. And for those of you who are new or seasoned with NW3C, we have been in business for about 40-some years serving the law enforcement community. And with that said, I just wanted to share some of the new things that you may not be familiar with NW3C. Specifically our new legal templates that we have available for the law enforcement community, available once you have logged in, so that way it allows you to have boilerplate information, so that way in any event you need to get more information from your service provider, we have those accessible. And since we are presenting on mobile devices today, we do have a few mobile device training opportunities as well. We have our cellular records and analysis class under our cybercrime courses. We have our mobile device forensic analysis class, and then also new coming down the pike is our advanced mobile device acquisition, or AMDA, which is actually going on right now here in Fairmont, where we're taking students from state and local agencies, teaching them how to chip off and JTAG with a low budget in mind. Now for just some housekeeping issues. We are recording the webinar to be viewed at a later date. We will either be hosting it or Magnet or a combination of both, but regardless of who's hosting it, we will email you with the link to view it at a later time. A lot of you may have questions for me or Jamie. Please direct them to the Q&A box, so that way we can answer them either as they happen or throughout Jamie's presentation. We'll take a pause during a transition to answer any applicable questions, and then also at the end we'll try to answer as many questions that we have in the duration that we allotted for this webinar. Also, hopefully everyone can hear us loud and clear. The toll-free number was provided in the chat box, or excuse me, in the event information, and you can always come in. If you are having problems, just send NW3C webinars a note for the panelists, and I'll be happy to assist you. And while we're here, mobile forensic acquisition and analysis continue to challenge even the most experienced professionals in the industry. Encryption, various forms of device locks, and ever new releases of the devices, operating system, apps, and versions constantly require forensic examiners to adapt their methods. So we're going to join Magnet's Jamie McQuaid, who's a forensic consultant for Magnet, to see these trends and the impacts they have on our investigations. And in particular, Jamie will explore various acquisition methods and will demystify many of the common mobile forensic acquisition techniques that are used by your forensic tools, so that you can be better equipped to get more value from your tool set. So I'll pass it over to Jamie, and he'll take it from here.
Thanks, John. Let me just grab the presenter here. There we go. Should be just coming up for you now. Perfect. Welcome, everyone. My name, like John said, is Jamie McQuaid. I'm with Magnet Forensics, and I'm a forensics consultant there. So typically when I start off webinars, I like to explain why I chose a given topic. And today we're going to talk about better data, better investigations, understanding mobile forensic trends, tools, and methods. And John kind of hinted to a lot of that. Is I really want to demystify some of the methods that your tools are using to pull data from these phones, and that's just going to be one part of it. But a lot of this presentation was built on a lot of the common questions that I get from customers, users, other examiners, and a lot of them aren't tool specific necessarily. It's just a better understanding of how these tools pull this data can be really helpful in your investigations, and this is what I deal with on a day in, day out basis. So hopefully I can pass some of that knowledge on to you guys today, and hopefully there'll be some follow-up questions with that as well. And like John said, we can address them as they go through, or at the end. Doesn't matter to me. I'm perfectly flexible with that. So with that in mind, let's dive right in here. So a quick agenda, a brief introduction about myself, then we're going to talk about some differences of challenges between acquisition and analysis on a higher level. We're going to talk about device adoption and encryption, and how encryption plays in, because that's obviously a major factor in both the acquisition and the analysis side. We're going to talk about, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time, is talking about the acquisition methods between iOS and Android. And I'm focusing on iOS and Android because that's probably 90–95% of what most devices you guys are seeing these days. We don't not going to spend time covering some of the other ones, but iOS and Android, there's plenty of information there to cover the hour for sure. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a bit about app encryption and how that can impact your investigation as well. And like I said, I have Q&A at the end there, but we can address that as we go along, or I'll save it all to the end. Either way works for me. So real quick, John already introduced me, so I'll skim over this. Like I said, my name is Jamie McQuaid. I'm a forensics consultant at Magnet Forensics. I've been with Magnet for about 5 years now. Before that, I worked as a corporate investigator for BlackBerry, or Research in Motion. I did anything from physical investigations to malware intrusions, IP theft, policy violations, you name it. I did those types of investigations. Obviously, corporate side, corporate typically doesn't deal with mobile phones as much, but obviously, given where I work, mobile phones were certainly a part of that. So now I'm at Magnet. I do a lot of our webinars, speak at conferences, write a lot of our blogs, or generally just try to help out anywhere I can, and that's kind of my role now here at Magnet. So let's jump into it. And first, I want to start with some initial thoughts, and this is really kind of my introducing some of this and why I've kind of gone down this path with this presentation is understanding the difference between acquisition and analysis seems like it's an easy task, but it's not as easy as you'd think, and it's not as obvious in many circumstances as it can. This is something I deal with on a regular basis. Quite often somebody will come up to me and say, hey, Jamie, you know, IEF or Axiom didn't get me WhatsApp or Skype or whatever data they need. And the first thing I need to do is separate, did they get the right acquisition, or did our tool not get the data from it, or do the proper analysis? You need to separate that acquisition problem versus analysis problem, because if you go in blindly and not understand it, you're obviously going to have a lot harder time. But if you can immediately separate whether it was an issue with the acquisition or an issue with the analysis, that's going to make your job a lot harder. And again, that's something I do a lot on my side, but that's also something that can benefit you in your analysis as well. So mobile acquisition methods vary in the data provided. I think that's pretty obvious. Everyone would love to get a physical acquisition every single time for every single device. That's not the reality of what we have here. So you need to question, is the data that you want in the image you acquired? Even if it's there, is it encrypted, right? You can get a physical acquisition on a lot of devices, but if the data is still encrypted, it's not going to be very helpful for you. And the same thing goes, physical acquisitions aren't always possible given certain types of devices. So you might be required to get a logical acquisition, and that might be enough in some circumstances, but in other circumstances it might not. So obviously you're going to get the best acquisition you can out of it, but there are varying degrees of that, and I'm going to try to break down a few options and ways to recognize that for you guys. One thing to remember right off the top around encryption is device encryption on the actual device from the OS, and that will impact your type of acquisition method you choose. App encryption, which is dealt with afterwards, that will impact the analysis, and I'll dive into that a little bit later. But that's an important thing to understand. And next, try multiple tools. Obviously I work for a vendor who creates some of these tools, but I'm a firm believer of we're not going to be the best tool in every scenario that you ever come across. We're not always going to get you the best acquisition. We're not always going to get you the best analysis. There's too many variables involved with that. So use multiple tools. Different tools will do better, different things better. And, timing is always a major point in that. A tool might have added newer support for something that's been around for a long time, and it might do a better job of it, or it might be another tool might have just been the first tool to add that support for it, and no other tool has it. So really understand both on the acquisition and the analysis side is use multiple tools in your investigation to get the best results. And then finally, I'm going to touch on this right at the end, is you can't analyze what isn't there. Whether the data is not in the type of acquisition you chose, or it's not even on the device at all. And this is something I'm going to say is cloud may be your only option in some circumstances. There's going to be times when certain apps don't save anything to the phone. It's all in the cloud, and it's just querying the cloud data to pull that down. And I'll use some examples of that. But that's certainly a reality of, if you asked me maybe a year or two ago, I would have said no way. It's certainly a reality of today. So definitely keep that in mind, that cloud might be your only option to get the evidence you need. So let's start with the more obvious one, device adoption and encryption. And before we can talk about acquisitions, and that's really what we're going to get at here in this part, is we need to talk about encryption, because if there's encryption on there, it's going to impact the type of acquisition you do. Now, before you can talk encryption, you need to talk about OS adoption rates, because that's going to have a factor of determining whether the device you have is encrypted or not. So let's talk about device adoption first. And this is an older slide that I've used, but it's a good breakdown to understand that iOS and Android are two very different beasts. iOS and Android, we'll go into the numbers, but most iPhones these days are all encrypted. Most people know that you're not going to get a physical acquisition of an iPhone these days because it's encrypted. Android, a little bit different. You are seeing more and more encryption. Like I said, these charts are a little bit older. I've got some newer data on the next few slides, but they really show how different iOS and Android are. And I got to preface this is when you compare iOS and Android, a lot of people can't compare it from apples to apples. iOS being the latest version is quite secure, the latest version that they're running. Android, the latest version, is actually quite secure as well, to be completely honest. The value or the difference between iOS and Android is the adoption rates. So that's what we're going to touch on right here. And let's start with iOS adoption rates. So I pulled two different sets of numbers here. More recently, you can see May 31st of this year, 81% of users were on iOS 11. Whatever version of it, it could be iOS 11.0, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're on iOS 11. That's a lot of people on iOS 11. 14% on iOS 10. And even if you look a little bit further back, I had pulled these numbers in January, 65% of people were on iOS 11 by January 18th. Now, iOS 11 was released September 19th of 2017. So from September to January, that was 4 months. And it took 4 months for Apple to get or 65% of their users up to iOS 11. That's a pretty good adoption rate. And obviously 8 months later, double that time, and they're up to 81%. And, there's only 14% on iOS 10 or 5% on earlier versions. That's a really good adoption rate. And to be honest, there's nothing stopping the other users that are on iOS 10 from moving up to 11. That's actually based on the user's choice. The user chooses if they want to update or not. So those 14% could easily move up to iOS 11. There's no barriers to that, which is in stark contrast to what you might see in with Android, which we'll show in a second. Now, you can see device encryption, some high-level stuff. I already covered a little bit of this, but obviously you're not getting physical access on anything iPhone 4S or newer, and they keep adding more and more security controls. I'll talk a bit more about them a little later on, but my colleague Chris Vance just did a webinar on the latest iOS 11 stuff around the timeouts and whatnot. So really, I'm not going to focus too much on that because he covered it all. But really, the reality is is iOS is constantly adding security patching, eliminating things. You won't get as much file system stuff when they eliminated the ability to do file relay service and whatnot. Like I said, I'll talk about it a bit further, but really understand that Apple is taking security as a priority here is the most important thing. For Android, it's a little bit better of an outlook. Not great, but still better than many others. Physical access is still available for some devices. And now that will depend on the OS it shipped on versus the OS it was upgraded to. That actually plays into account. If a device ships with a particular version and then is upgraded, encryption might not be required. But if it shipped with Android 6, 7, 8, you've basically got encryption on by default. So it's not always encrypted by default, but depending on the upgrade path, it's certainly going to be a factor. Now, roots, there are some out there that you can utilize for the later versions, but you're really not dealing with rooting. There are other methods you can get into the physical access to these phones, but rooting isn't really an ideal method to do that. It's certainly an option, but for the later versions, I would recommend some other methods, which I'll talk about here as well. And then finally, JTAG, chip off, ISP type methods, which we'll touch on. Those are certainly viable options if the chip is unencrypted. Obviously, those methods aren't helping with encryption. They are certainly going to help only if the data is unencrypted. So talking about the Android OS adoption, and I just pulled this yesterday, but the numbers are as of July 23rd, so pretty recent, within the last 2 weeks. And finally, Nougat, Android Nougat 7.0 or 7.1 has finally become the most used OS. For the longest time, Lollipop and Marshmallow took the largest percentage of users. Nougat has finally hit 30%. You can see Marshmallow still at about 23%. So a lot of people on Marshmallow, still a good chunk even on Lollipop or the older versions. But Nougat at least has moved over. And, you know, Nougat was released 2 years ago, August 22nd, 2016. That's about 2 years. So it took 2 years for Android to get to 30% of Nougat, well, plus the newer Oreo stuff, but that's only 12% on the latest Oreo. So that's really much lower numbers than what you see with iOS. And it tends to be about 2 versions behind. You're seeing more and more Nougat because Oreo's out and Pi, I believe they just released the Android 9, they just released the beta for that yesterday or some point this week. So you can get it if you have a Google Pixel phone. The reason here isn't because the users, right? When I spoke about iOS, the users were a big part of this. They chose to update, and it was purely the user's choice. With Android, that's not the case. Android depends on the manufacturers and carriers to push out the updates. Apple has a strong arm and can control that. Android manufacturers do not have that. All the updates have to go through carrier. They have to go through carrier testing and that, which takes a really long time. So there are there are a lot of barriers in terms of trying to get to the latest version. I have a Samsung Galaxy S7. Just sitting beside me here, which is my daily phone. It shipped with Android Marshmallow, which is good. It's been a great phone for me and everything. It's still not brand new, but new enough. It did get the Nougat update, and actually, surprisingly, I didn't expect it. I did get an Oreo update within the last month or so, but that's taken years for that Oreo update to come down. And to be honest, I give them credit. I wasn't even expecting to get that. I didn't think they'd actually roll it out to my phone. I thought it would only be the newer phones, but still, they did get to the newer version. It just took 2 years to do so. So understanding that, we'll understand when we can start talking about the acquisition methods, what's available to us, because really you're applying exploits to these phones that have been patched already. A lot of the times, if you've got the latest and greatest, a lot of these exploits that the tools use have already been patched if you've got the latest version of the OS on. But we're banking on the users generally having a few versions older, or a release that's a few versions old, and is still susceptible to a given exploit, and it hasn't been patched yet. So let's jump into some of those acquisition methods. First off, let's talk high level. And this is, I put this common acquisition method slide up here really to help people understand the big thing here is terminology. Every tool will call their methods different things, and there's nothing really wrong with that unless they're using something that's way out there. Generally, most tools are okay with it. This is how I define a lot of our stuff here at Magnet, me personally, or us at Magnet. And most tools kind of follow the same thing. There are some variations. If you're using something like Celebrate, there is some slight differences here that I'll call out, but generally, the logical, file system, and physical are pretty common terms that get used. Logical, now this is the one piece that I would say is different between what I believe is logical versus what Celebrate calls it. Logical is an iTunes backup or an ADB backup. This is a backup of the phone. That's a logical acquisition. Now, Celebrate kind of just uses the agent for that. For us, we include the logical as the iTunes backup, but also for many Android devices, you can install an agent to pull additional data as well. And I'll get into that agent and the provider data that it can pull in a bit. But really, to understand, it's still going to be a logical acquisition. The big barrier to this is you're restricted by APIs and permissions. So you are restricted to connect to the phone by only certain means that the phone allows you to connect to. So you're restricted by that and the user level permissions. So if you are user level, you can only get so many permissions. You would need to move up to more of a root or file system level stuff to get better permissions. Now, one other note here at the very end of the logical one, applications choose to be backed up or not. Quite often I get asked, they're like, hey, I did a quick acquisition or a logical acquisition of an Android device, but it didn't get me Facebook Messenger or whatever app is there, or Snapchat or something like that. And I said, well, do you know if that app actually allows to be backed up? Because that's not something we can choose to pull from a logical acquisition. Remember, we're restricted by the APIs of that device. So if the app chooses not to be backed up, it unchecks that box and says, don't back me up. There's nothing you can do at the logical level to get past that. There is app downgrading and stuff like that that you could certainly use, but generally it's the application itself that chooses to be backed up or not, and that can change on a whim. I know I had a customer who reached out to me once and said, oh, your Skype's broken. And I was like, okay, well, let's take a look at this. Okay, we'll see. Sometimes stuff breaks. It's the name of the game sort of thing. But what we'll often see is I looked at the Skype data for this case, and I was like, okay, all my Skype data's here. I don't know what's up with yours and everything. And then I realized they did a logical acquisition. They did an ADB backup of the device. Well, Microsoft just all of a sudden decided to stop backing up the data, the main database. And I was like, oh, well, the data is still on the phone. Your acquisition method is just not getting the same data it got yesterday. So that can change at any moment, is whether the application chooses to be backed up is a really important factor to that. If it's not being backed up, then you have to move up to the next level, something either a file system or a physical method. Now, the file system is also a logical acquisition. It's also only logical data included into it, and you're still limited by the API. Now, you're going to have more permissions than your regular logical there, but you are still limited to connect it to the phone directly through certain APIs. But you're doing so via a privileged access, either rooting or jailbreaking or something like that, in order to get access to that device. You're going to get all the files and folders, but you're not going to get the same stuff you would in a physical, like deleted or unallocated space. You may get deleted data, maybe deleted records within a SQLite database or something like that, but you're not going to get your traditional unallocated space like you would, say, a computer that you got a full physical dump of or anything like that. So it's important to distinguish that. And then finally, on the other side is physical. Now, obviously, everyone ideally wants to get a physical acquisition. They want to include all the blocks for Android device, MMC block 0, all the deleted data. You're basically getting the entire phone. And this is ideal. Not always possible, though. Lots of different ways we'll talk about getting there. Recovery methods, bootloader methods, JTAG, ISP, chip off. Those are all great ways to get physical access. Now, remember, these methods that I talk about here generally will bypass lock screens, but not necessarily the device encryption, especially around the JTAG ISP chip-off stuff. They're going to get past you the lock screens, but if the data is still encrypted, it's not going to get you past that encryption. So be aware of that and understand that some of those methods may not get you all the way that you need or everywhere you need to go for it. So just be aware of that. Another quick side note, and this is kind of a personal thoughts of Jamie, I guess, here is around model numbers. Now, a lot of tools out there will start their acquisition workflow by providing model numbers. They say, oh, we support this model, this model, this model, and this model. I really try to avoid that because providing the model numbers only tells part of the story. A lot of acquisition methods, for one, aren't model specific. So if you put the model number in there, it might not mean, it might work, it might not. It's not specific to that. Obviously, most logical acquisitions don't matter about the actual model unless that specific model is doing something very weird and different. But ADB, iTunes, MTP acquisitions, OTG methods, all those logical methods, they all work, doesn't matter what the model is. There's other factors involved. The LG bypass for physical acquisitions that I'll talk about, those don't matter about model numbers either. And even some might not be model specific, they might be chipset specific. The EDL methods, the MTK methods, stuff like that are based on chipsets, not models. So the real thing to understand is model numbers aren't going to give you the whole story. Well, I can use the example of my Samsung Galaxy S7 that I have here, and you know, saying this is, now I'm Canadian if you haven't noticed the voice yet, but I've got the Canadian model version of the S7 Edge. Putting that model number into a tool and saying, is it supported or not? Well, they could say yes, but they have no idea without actually pulling the device what OS is on there. And like I said, this phone shipped with Marshmallow, it got upgraded to Nougat, and then it got upgraded to Oreo. That has a major factor into what types of methods you can try here. With Oreo on here now, I've actually blocked a few methods in terms of downgrading firmware and not being able to get engineering boots or certain methods that I might want to get for this phone. So that actually becomes a reality of just understand that just because the model says it's supported or isn't listed there doesn't mean you shouldn't try it or shouldn't dig into and investigate whether or not it can be done, because model numbers are only part of the story there. One of the big benefits there is that you can image, if you don't rely so much on model numbers, you can image unsupported devices. You can just say, okay, it's not on the list, but try it. Well, okay, it works, great. Oh, well, now I guess you can add it to the list, or you can just understand that it's not always as black and white as you would think. A lot of this, the other things is a new device. You know, a tool might take 4 months to add support for a new device, but if you don't rely on model numbers, you can try a new device that came out yesterday, and yeah, maybe it might not work, but maybe it does, and you can continue on with your investigation. And then finally, never release devices. This is something I came across more often in my role than probably the average person would, but I dealt with devices that never saw the light of day. I dealt with devices that were never actually meant to go public or anything like that, so I'd look at them and focusing on model numbers obviously wouldn't get me anywhere because no tool would actually support something that wasn't public. So that's another factor. Now, obviously, that's probably specific to me, but it's certainly important as well. So let's jump into iOS acquisition methods. So first off, let's talk about the iOS connections methods. Now, this is generally the way you can connect to iOS devices, no matter what tool you're using our tools, Axiom, Acquire, anything like that, or whatever other tool you're using. You can connect to the phone these ways. You can manually do a lot of this as well. Tools are there to help make your job easier. They're not the only factor involved with a lot of this stuff. So iTunes backups, obviously that's a major piece to it. iCloud backups, obviously we'll get into cloud stuff a bit more later on. MTP, the media folder, you're no longer getting the container stuff for iOS devices, which is unfortunate, but reality of that. AFC2, if the phone's jailbroken, it's an older jailbroken iOS device, or SSH on the newer ones. You may also note the AFC stuff, like I said earlier, for the containers, that was killed in iOS 8.3, so you no longer got the container stuff. And then also file relay service, that was killed in iOS 8. that basically stopped us from getting emails on iOS devices. Most tools use the file relay service to pull emails, iOS email, to pull that stuff. When the file relay service went down, that kind of killed it for most investigations or most forensics tools. Now, one thing to note, file relay service, if you were actually investigating or looking at a phone with an iOS beta build, typically those beta builds have the file relay service turned on. So you may actually be able to get email if the user was using a beta phone that has the file relay service on. Rare that you're going to come across a user that is using beta builds or anything like that, but it's certainly a possibility. I just wanted to call that out there because it is on for those betas. Another note, like I said, I'm not going to get into it too much because my colleague Chris went into it just last week, but Grey Key, obviously using an exploit to get into, to crack passcodes, and that is certainly another method to get onto those devices that wasn't available, 8 months, a year ago to most of us. So that's certainly another one. And I've used Grey Key images before, and I've been able to pull really good data from them, even memory, which is great. But I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So iTunes, iCloud backup, start with those. This is typically what most of your tools are using to get on an iOS device. Barring services or the Grey Key boxes, most tools are basically getting you an iTunes backup. They get you they connect the same way through the same API using iTunes, whether you're using Axiom, Acquire, Celebrate, Oxygen. All of the tools are connecting using the same method. This is how you're getting most iOS devices. So valuable. It's not the greatest, but it's certainly the only option for the most part. It doesn't matter if it's a free tool or a paid tool. Everyone's in the same boat for iOS devices. Again, aside from the Grey Key part of it that I just mentioned. Obviously, in iOS 10, they've changed their entire backup structure, the encryption and all of that, which was a pain. I recall adding support. They made a change in 10.1, 10.2, or is it 10.0, 10.1, 10.2, and I know all of the tools had to add support for each one of those because they changed them around. That was a bit of a pain, but they've settled on that pretty consistent after that, so that's okay. The only real option that you have is whether you want to get an encrypted or an unencrypted backup. And this is an iOS option. Most people think, hey, I want an unencrypted backup because it's easier to read. The reality is you probably want an encrypted backup. Why? Because there's more data in it. Now, you can choose to create that encrypted backup and with your own passcode that in certain circumstances. So the reason why is you get additional data. You get the HomeKit data, HealthKit data, and more importantly, the keychain, which has usernames and passwords for different accounts and that. So the keychain data is really helpful there. So that's why you're going to want to create an encrypted backup. Now, if the user has set a backup passcode, you have to create a backup anyway. The user set that. There's no going around that. But if the user hasn't set one, you can set one yourself during the acquisition. Most tools will either do it automatically for you. I know with ours, we will let you put in your own passcode. So either way it works. The key is if you get an encrypted backup, you're getting more data. Now, if the user has set their own backup passcode, before iOS 11, that was a huge pain. With iOS 10 or earlier versions, you were actually kind of out of luck unless you could crack that passcode. So if the user had a backup sitting on their desktop, you weren't able to decrypt it because they had a passcode set to it. Now, with iOS 11, you can remove that backup passcode. You can actually go through, reset the settings, and it will allow you to remove that passcode for iOS 11 devices. Now, obviously, that's only new backups. So if there are old historical backups there, you're not going to be able to decrypt those unless you know the user's passcode or iTunes backup password. But what you can do is you can reset it and create a new backup, and that's going to be set to whatever passcode you set. And a lot of people, Cindy Murphy, I believe, and a few others have actually documented the steps of taking the user's phone and upgrading it from iOS 11 or 10 to 11 in order to take advantage of this feature that Apple included in iOS 11. Obviously, you're going to make some minor changes to the user's phone by upgrading it from a major OS from 10 to 11, but it's certainly worth it if you're stuck with no other methods. And then finally, also, you can use the iCloud data to pull backups from the cloud. So historical backups from the cloud is another option there. More obvious method to connect to a device, MTP, Media Transfer Protocol. This one's pretty standard, and it works across pretty much any phone, including iOS devices. You pull pictures, video, media from cameras, phones, whatnot. Most people have seen this plugging into your computer, and you get that MTP method there. Used to be Picture Transfer Protocol, now it's Media Transfer Protocol. And it's nice, but you're not going to get a lot of app data or third-party data. I consider it one of those better than nothing sort of things, the MTP acquisition, just because it's a universal one. But maybe all you want is pictures, and that might be enough. It used to, like I said about the AFC stuff, it used to include the containers, but now it's only going to be the media there. AFC, AFC2, and SSH. Obviously, like I said, AFC allows access to the media. AFC2 we used to use to get the entire file system. They basically, for the jailbroken devices for AFC2, newer devices, the AFC2 service isn't there. You can install it, but it's kind of a pain. Most people are using OpenSSH over USB, usually as part of the jailbreak if they are jailbreaking devices, and manually doing it that way. That's certainly an option for you. It's rare that you're going to come across an already jailbroken device, and it's debatable whether or not you want to actually go through the jailbroking process, but the option's certainly there. So let's talk about Android acquisition methods. ADB, agent application, MTP, recovery, bootloader, JTAG, ISP chip-off. That's a pretty good bucket. There's probably a few other ones specific within those. Obviously, a couple of different bootloader methods. But we'll get into most of these and a few examples of each, and kind of go through there. Again, we're going from probably most logical to physical or more challenging ones, but we'll start with the ADB. Now, an ADB backup, just like an iTunes backup, it's using the Android debug bridge. You can manually do this, or you could use a tool. Most tools support ADB as part of it. You could just use their SDK, Android's SDK, to actually do this yourself if you wanted to do the command line. Again, tools are really there just to make your job easier. So this is the most common way you're going to pull stuff from an Android device, though. In general, you're going to use the API to connect to it, do a backup. Every tool does it a little different. Now, the typical output, if you're using the SDK, is backup.ab, and that's a backup file for ADB. Us, or Celebrate, other tools may package it a little differently, might put it in a zip along with other stuff. The backup AB is basically how it's presented to you, and really all that is a zip container. You can rename it to .zip, open it up, and take a look inside. It's very easy. Again, a reminder, applications choose what to be backed up or not. They also choose what to get backed up. It's also good to distinguish that. They choose whether or not the entire app wants to get backed up, or they might choose not to back up this particular database. They may back up some, not all. It's totally up to the application themselves. So really key thing to remember here is if the application data you need is not in an ADB backup or the agent one, which we'll talk about next, you're going to have to go a little bit deeper and try different methods. Another limitation of the ADB backup is it requires unlock. You need to have the passcode. You need to be able to put the phone in USB debug mode, all of that, in order to get an ADB backup in the first place, which is not always possible in certain circumstances. If somebody's not providing the unlock or not being helpful with it, that might not be an option. If you have it, this is going to be a quick, easy way to pull some data from the phone and see what you get. Often, you'll usually get the pictures, video, browsers, some app data, some chat, depends on the app. Facebook Messenger, Skype, WhatsApp, those typically choose not to be included in an update. So be aware that if you do that and you're looking specifically for those types of apps, make sure you might need to go a little bit deeper and try different methods. So the agent application, and this is something I mentioned I'd come back to, is a lot of people call this slightly different things. Basically what you're doing here, and you're basically installing an application or an agent to the device to pull data. So we have an agent that we go on and we'll install it to the user's phone and pull additional data that doesn't get included in a regular ADB backup. And the way we do this is through Android content providers. So this is a mechanism in Android that allows you to connect or apps to connect to each other. So you just build your own app and you say, oh, give me content provider data, and they'll provide it. Typically, you're going to get stuff like calendar, contacts, telephone stuff. It's limited to a few things, but it's certainly helpful because a lot of that stuff doesn't get backed up in a regular backup all the time. So it's using the content providers along with an ADB backup is a nice balance. The agent part is part of a logical stuff for Celebrate, but the ADB backup is usually part of a file system one, depending on Celebrate methods. For us, we kind of combine it into one. So we will, if we do a quick logical acquisition, we'll typically give you an agent content provider dump as well as the ADB backup in there as well. So you kind of get both in there. It also requires unlock. Obviously, it's the same type of criteria as an ADB backup. That's why we kind of do them hand in hand together. But like I said, you're only going to get those few things there. Everything else would be excluded, like a lot of your third-party app data and whatnot is going to be excluded from that. Media transfer protocol. I already went over this. It's basically the exact same for Android as it is for iOS. It's available on most devices. It's pretty simple. You're getting pictures, video, the occasional third-party app data, and you typically require unlock to get access to this. However, I put an asterisk there because there is actually an exception to that. This is something we built into our tool a while back. It's actually an exploit that you use. It's a bypassing the passcode and doing an MTP acquisition on Samsung devices. So basically what it can do is even on a locked device, you connect it, do this exploit, and you can get an MTP acquisition without knowing the passcode for the device. So it's nice. Obviously, an MTP acquisition isn't ideal. I'd still prefer an ADB backup or a file system dump. But there are a lot of scenarios where that's the best you're going to get. I had my colleague had a Samsung, I think it was actually a 7, just like the one I've got here, that had a busted up screen. It wouldn't work, and he couldn't actually replace the screen. I don't know what was wrong with it that he couldn't replace the screen, but he even knew the passcode but couldn't put it in because the screen was broken. He tried this method, worked just fine. He was able to get an MTP acquisition. I know most of you probably have a box of phones sitting in the corner of one day you're going to be able to get into these phones. This is just one of those scenarios where give it a try. It might get you something better than nothing. Now, like I said, a lot of these exploits get patched already. This one was patched by Samsung in October or November 2017, depending on the model. Each model was patched to either October or November, so it depends on the model which one. But there's a lot of devices out there that don't have a patch level as new as that. So it's still certainly a viable option to, as long as the patch level is before that date, to try this method. Samsung recovery messages. So continuing on with the Samsung devices is if anybody's used Odin or anything like that to manually flash a recovery image, basically you're putting the device into a recovery mode and flashing a recovery image to it. This is basically if something goes wrong with the phone, it's set up that you could flash to the recovery method, and it's usually used by developers and engineers to fix issues. Well, we can use it in forensics. Obviously, for Samsung devices, you basically put the phone into download mode, volume down, home, and power buttons, or if you've got a cable that does that, it shorts out the cable. You can use it. Either way works. And what you can do is you flash your own recovery image or your own image to the recovery partition, allowing you to bypass the passcode and giving you physical possible acquisition. Now, the big limitations here, and specifically for people in North America, is it doesn't work on any device that has a locked bootloader. So Verizon devices, a lot of AT&Ts, a lot of the US-based devices have locked bootloaders or FRP turned on. That's a limitation that you can't use recovery images for. Canada, Europe, a lot of them don't have that issue. That's something that's set by the carrier. So usually these work quite well in a lot of parts of the world, and it gives you that physical acquisition. Now, if the device is encrypted, so if you've got a newer device, you can still get a physical acquisition using the recovery images, but you're going to get, because if there's encryption on the device, you're going to get an encrypted image. So you need to be careful with that, and you need to understand that to make sure don't use it on an encrypted device because it's going to be a waste of time. LG download mode. LG's got its own update mode. You can actually use this, basically volume up and plug in the cable, and it puts it in its own mode. This also gets a physical acquisition bypassing the passcode. This one works really well. It works on a lot of LG devices, not so much on some of the newest ones, but you're still limited by the encryption. So the LG one is certainly worth trying. It's a very easy one to do, whether your tool does it or if you want to figure out how to do it manually, but it certainly works quite well as well. MDK devices. MDK is a chipset-specific exploit. So MDK chipsets are pretty common in a lot of lower-end Chinese mid to low-price phones. This also gets you a passcode bypass and physical acquisition. There's a lot of blue phones, LG, Sony, HTC devices have MediaTek chipsets to them, and this will work quite often for it in the same limitations of the encryption that you had with the LG and the recovery modes as well, or recovery methods. Motorola bootloader, another method. This is a privilege escalation. Basically, it's kind of an interesting one. Basically, you're booting into a RAM image. So you're actually loading in an image, but not into the recovery partition like you would with the recovery images. You're loading it into memory and then just pointing it to that instead of the regular image there. The exploit's there from 2016, but it still affects a lot of Motorola devices, including Nexus 6. It was patched in May 2017, but like I said, there are quite a few devices out there that still work for this one. I just like it. It's kind of a unique one because you're actually dumping this into to memory instead of a recovery image like the other ones that you would normally use. And then a bucket, there's a whole bunch of other ones here. I'm not going to get into too much. Engineering roots or boots that are very helpful for Samsung devices. Basically, the problem with locked bootloaders is you're throwing in a recovery image that's untrusted. With locked bootloaders, they check that, but with the engineering boots, these are assigned boot images or boot code to the device, so they're trusted. So you can get past the locked bootloaders part if you're using these types of methods. Now the problem is these methods this code is signed, so it's owned by Samsung. It was leaked by someone, and it's not really something you can really put in a forensics tool and would not get sued. But generally, these methods certainly work. That's why a lot of your tools won't go into adding these, but the methods certainly work quite well. Qualcomm has a bootloader method, and then EDL is another method as well. Very similar for Qualcomm chipsets that are specific to the chipsets, and allows you to put it into emergency download and use the EDL method to get it. I know Celebrate has support for the EDL stuff, and I'm not sure who else has added support for it, but it's a pretty interesting method to do the emergency download ones as well. And then finally on JTAG, ISP, and chip off. I won't cover too much of this, but JTAG basically soldering on to the test ports. It's not as common anymore, and encryption is not going to help, but it will allow you to connect to the CPU and pull that data right on the circuit board or on the board. It connects through the CPU. ISP is one step further than that. You're connecting directly to the capacitors and resistors. You can see that screenshot beside it there. Those little wires popping out of there, that's ISP. It's still going to have an encryption problem, and if you're like me, you've got shaky hands, and those are tiny, tiny wires. I struggle with ISP because I don't probably have enough practice in them, but it's certainly another viable method to it. And then finally, chip off as your last resort. I always tell people there's no such thing as chip on, or no, it's pretty rare that there's chip on. So if you go to do a chip off, that's going to be your last step. Make sure you don't have encryption on, because you're destroying the device at this point, and once you chip off, you can't chip it back on, and you're going to be dealing with an encrypted chip. Encryption is much easier to deal with when it's on the phone than it is when it's off the phone. There are physical methods that you might need to get into that phone, so be careful of that when you go through. Quick note on MDM. A lot of questions from the corporate side around dealing with MDM. The most obvious thing is, or the most, I guess the shortest answer is work with IT. Obviously, if there's MDM on there, there's an IT department associated to that likely. MDM does not play well with forensics tools. It's going to block ADB or iTunes, USB debugging, custom images, stuff like that. So disabling MDM will be important to a lot of these investigations. And assuming that you have support from IT or the business, that's certainly something you need to work with them on. Easier said than done, but certainly helpful. There is that the link to the article there, Samsung Secure Boot and Common Criteria. This is from DFRWS in Europe earlier this year. Really good paper about bypassing MDM options in the secure boot stuff for Samsung devices. I haven't tried it. I haven't played with their methods, but it's certainly something that I would keep an eye out for and to see if there's ways that we can use this to disable MDM and bypass MDM in certain circumstances. Quick note on the quick versus full. This is a bit more specific to acquire an axiom. Quite often, the big thing I always tell people is understand whether you got a locked device or an unlocked device. That's going to dictate how you go through these methods, and recognize there's a field there that says privileged access, yes or no. Usually that's going to say no. It just means that whether the phone's rooted or not, or jailbroken or not. That's going to really help dictate whether or not the type of acquisition you're going to get. So pay attention to those fields there. So in a summary, physical is great, but it's not always an option. Logical images are limited by the API. File systems still logical, but it's going to get you a little bit more. App developers choose what gets backed up or not, so that's unfortunate, but reality of it. And then iOS, you're basically limited to an iTunes backup, unless you've got a Grey Key image or a Grey Key box that you can use, which is certainly a good option there. And then sometimes JTAG and ISP and chip off is sometimes even easier than working with an API. So as long as encryption is not your problem, JTAG and ISP is actually not that bad. And then finally, you can't analyze what isn't there. That's kind of lead into the cloud stuff I was just going to quickly talk about. So really quick on the analysis side, I know we're cutting it a little short here, going a little bit over my time here, but I want to touch on analysis real quick. So really analyzing any images. The key is use your tools as you see fit. Get any of those. Every tool that you use, the more data you're going to get. You're going to get different analysis from each of them. So grab images from anywhere. You get the best acquisition you can and throw it in every tool that you have available. So be aware of that. Every tool creates slightly different stuff, but most of them do a lot of stuff that can be interchanged between tools. I've done blogs on how to load Celebrate images or Oxygen or XRY images or Grey Key images into Axiom. You can do it vice versa as well. We don't do anything proprietary there. So play with your tools, and whatever you've got access to, run it against it, because you're definitely going to get different results. Quick note on app encryption. Once you get past the device encryption, device acquisition, that might not be your only challenge. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I wanted to point out two types of app encryption that you may come across. Even after you get maybe a full physical dump of a phone, you may still have to deal with encryption certain ways. The first one is encrypted databases and files. This is your common encrypted data. The whole file's encrypted, all the content's there, can't be opened with your tools. It looks like junk. I don't know what that is anymore. I can't remember if that was Signal or something like that. But I think that's actually a BBM database. But you can see it looks like junk. That's because it's just the entire file is encrypted. You need to decrypt it before you can get anywhere with that type of encryption. The second one is encrypted content. This one's still a little bit more helpful. Even if you are unable to decrypt this, you can still use data in an encrypted content scenario. So basically the file or the database is unencrypted. It's readable. You can see it's a SQLite database or something like that with a header on it. And the structure is visible, and you open it with your tools, but some of the fields will be encrypted. So you can see along the right side there, that's encrypted data there. And this is Signal, actually. So this is what Signal looks like and on iOS and Android, this one's on iOS. But basically, you get part of the data encrypted, part of it's still readable. Now, I still have timestamps here. I have timestamps that can still be used in my investigation. Even if I'm unable to decrypt this data, I can still make use of this data for my investigations. I might not know what John and Jamie are talking about, but I certainly know John and Jamie had a conversation at on August 8th at 1 p.m. or something like that. I can still make use of that information in my investigation. Is it ideal? No, but it's still usable information. So be aware of that. The types of encryption that you may come across could be valuable there. A quick note on end-to-end encryption. When a tool or when an app says it's using end-to-end encryption, be wary of that. End-to-end encryption doesn't always mean it's encrypted at rest. And it usually means it's encrypted in transit, and as long as you're not man-in-the-middling at the carrier level or anything like that, if you've got the physical device, end-to-end encryption may not apply to you. Quite often I've seen a lot of apps claim they do end-to-end encryption, and it's not actually encrypted once you get on the device. If you have physical access to the device, it doesn't always mean you're dead in the water. So be aware of that. And then finally, all else fails, go to the cloud. Some stuff isn't even on the phone, whether it's encrypted or not. Some apps have moved past encryption and just store stuff in the cloud. If I use an example here, Facebook Messenger. Here's a quick timeline of Facebook Messenger. Early Facebook chat, that was easy to analyze. It had geolocation data for every message sent. It was golden. It was perfect. It was really great to investigate. They moved over to Facebook Messenger. They stopped adding geolocation data, which is fine, but not ideal. You no longer included it into a backup. And now if you use Facebook Messenger, you're not even seeing most of the messages stored on the device. They only store the most recent stuff on the device. If you put the phone in airplane mode and look at the physical phone, don't do this on an evidence phone, but do you on your own phone or whatever, you put the phone in airplane mode, see what messages you can read. Put the phone out of airplane mode and see what messages you can read. I assure you that there's going to be more messages that you can read when the phone's out of airplane mode and connected to the cloud than when if it's in airplane mode and not connected. A lot of those messages get grayed out and you can't actually read them unless you connect to the cloud. So be aware of that, because that's certainly a reality of what's happening these days. So that's everything I had. I apologize, I went a little bit over. Hopefully we've got a couple minutes to do questions. I'll pass it back to John, and he can take a look at the board there.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. It was quite informative, and hopefully all the participants on the line had some good takeaways. And Jeff did have a question. Speaking of encryption, have you had any experience and/or recommendations regarding Samsung Knox Secure Folder?
The Samsung Knox Secure Folder. I haven't done a lot with that. Just somebody came in with that not too long ago. So we do have stuff that we're working on with it. Specifically, I can't recall off the top of my head, but if you want to follow up with me, either through email or Twitter there, I can send you what we've got. I know a few people have been asking for that recently, so I'm just trying to remember. It's something that we've had a few asks for, but I can't recall off the top of my head where we've landed with it. We don't fully support it yet, but it is something we've wanted to look at going through. Before, with Knox and everything, hasn't been a problem, but the secure folder part of Knox has certainly played into it, and I know that's how a lot of the MDM solutions make use of on Samsung devices as well. So yeah, reach out to me afterwards, and I can double check where our guys are at with that.
All right, thanks for answering that question for Jeff, Jamie. If there isn't any other questions, one just trickled in from Jody. She has a coworker that had an LG Android phone come in with a parolee. Mm-hmm. He decided to do a Fourth Amendment on him, and he pulled out the phone and it was turned off, and when he turned it on, he hesitated putting in a PIN code, and once put in, he said the phone, and then that's where she stopped. Well, sorry, I didn't read the question come through. It must have been a limitation. Hopefully Jody can type the rest in.
I'm assuming it's a start. I'm guessing it might be the startup, the passcode required to boot the device.
And then the phone seemed barren, like no info.
No info. I'm assuming it's the startup passcode, which you can set in Android for certain things. If you can't get past that, then you're very limited to boot into some of those other recovery methods. You might need to get into some of the, I think you mentioned it was an LG phone.
Yes.
I would try the download mode method. That would get past the boot issue, but any other logical acquisition wouldn't help with that. Any of the MDP bypassing or anything like that wouldn't be an option because it's probably, I'm assuming it's referring to the boot passcode there, which is a pain because it's certainly limiting your options with it. But anything that you can do prior to that boot, getting into any sort of download mode or anything like that might be a way to handle that. Or if encryption isn't a problem, JTAG ISP chip off would probably be another method there.
Yeah, she mentioned that he alluded to maybe it being a hidden UI or something that was obfuscating what was being displayed or available.
Yeah, so there are a few builds. It's not standard Android to do that. You would have to get some custom flashing images on there. I haven't played a lot with them, and I haven't seen a lot with them, but it's more of a hidden, partition, kind of like the older TrueCrypt type stuff on computers. But I'm trying to think of the name of the actual distribution that does that. But yeah, you're kind of, that's why the big challenge is handing the phone over to a suspect is not an ideal situation, even if they are willing to put it in. I try to shy away with giving physical access to it back to them because they may trip something like that on purpose or accidental. It doesn't matter. It's still going to impact your investigation. But let me see if I can remember what kind of build that was, and I can't recall what custom ROM it was that did that, but I have heard of that before.
Very good. And if there are any other questions, we'll be here for a few more seconds. But while everyone's still on the line, if you have any topics that you would like to hear about from either NW3C, Magnet, or a collaborative effort, please let us know either in the chat, preferably in the chat. It could be high-level topics, specific things. That allows Jamie and myself just to collect our resources and see what our team members are able to come up with, so that way we can continue to serve our law enforcement communities. Kathy just asked a question. She wanted to know, if one has a physical extraction, is there any reason to get a logical or a file system extraction? Yes.
Short answer is encryption might be a problem. So I'm a firm believer of, usually I'm going to say probably 80% of the time the physical is going to have what you need, but the logical in some circumstances will occasionally get you stuff that you couldn't get with the physical. Obviously, there's the odd device level stuff that gets stored in the memory, may only be accessible through commands like the agent data and whatnot. But if you're dealing with apps that have encryption to them, or devices, even if you've got a physical, the entire device might still be encrypted. So I would first off verify it. But there are definitely scenarios where I tend to err on the just be careful. Many times I'll get that logical and I will never touch it because I got everything I needed, but I always do it because if I had to return the phone or I'd never have access to that phone again, it's a one-way street. Sometimes you're never going to be able to do that. So I err on the side of caution. Again, most of the time you're not going to need it, but there's going to be that one time you're going to be kicking yourself. You're like, I wish I just did a logical and pulled it. Because again, if you got the passcode, you might as well throw that in there as well. You've already gotten the physical, so you preserve the evidence as best you can. But there's always that one-off scenario that might come back and bite you.
Kathy said thanks. That's exactly what she needed to hear. Right now, Jamie, there isn't any other questions. I'll give it a few more seconds, see if anyone wants to collect their thoughts, because we still have a high percentage still on the line. Jamie, is there anything you alluded to? Obviously, with working with Magnet, is there anything on the roadmap coming out that's going to benefit law enforcement with some of the challenges that you guys have been able to overcome?
There's always stuff on the roadmap. I'm trying to think specifically here. What do we got? What can I talk about? Is the one. I did mention talked about SSH on jailbroken devices. That's something that's coming real soon. I know a few people have asked, like, we've got a jailbroken device, but AFC2 is no longer there for iOS devices. Can you help us get that? That was a method that wasn't working because we were relying on the AFC2 prior to that. We'll add the SSH option in there so you can actually still acquire through Axiom tools for that. That's a smaller one, but still valuable. Continue to update and add new methods. Definitely got some new acquisition stuff coming down. I don't want to say the next release, but in the next few. Always stuff going on there. We just added CPS data integration. So if you are using CPS data and you want to loop that into your Axiom tools, you can do that. We added that, I think, a version or two ago. Lots of stuff always there. If you are looking for something, reach out to me. My email address is there, Twitter. Jad, obviously, very approachable with these things. We're always up for ideas and any recommendations to say, hey, Jamie, I love this, but I wish you did this, or help me out with this or anything. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'd be happy to help out.
All right, thanks for sharing, Jamie. There isn't any other questions, so we are going to wrap this event up. Big thank you to Jamie McQuaid and Magnet for providing the content for everyone here. Everyone should get an email, and once we have the webinar posted, it'll be able to be viewed again, so you could share that with your colleagues or go back and review if there was something else that you missed or wanted to revisit. And we thank you guys. Stay safe, and catch us next time whenever we have one of our monthly/weekly webinars.